The dust settled around the wooden wagon as it rolled into Willow Creek, Texas in the summer of 1882. Inside sat a young woman with dark braided hair and copper skin, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her native Comanche tongue. She had been traveling for 3 days from the reservation, sent to marry a man she had never met. The townspeople gathered along Main Street, their whispers cutting through the hot afternoon air like sharp knives. Children pointed from behind, their mothers' skirts, while men shook their heads in disapproval. The local preacher's wife clutched her Bible closer to her chest and muttered something about mixing blood. Even the shopkeeper stopped sweeping his porch to stare with cold, unwelcoming eyes. Ayanna kept her gaze straight ahead, though her heart pounded like war drums in her chest. She had learned long ago not to show weakness when facing hatred. Her father, Chief Running Bear, had made this arrangement to secure peace between their struggling tribe and the white settlers. The marriage was supposed to bridge two worlds, but looking at the hostile faces around her, Ayanna wondered if some bridges were too wide to cross. The wagon stopped in front of a small wooden house at the edge of town. Her intended husband, Thomas Mackenzie, waited on the porch. He was a thin man with nervous eyes who avoided looking directly at her. Behind him stood his mother, a stern woman whose lips pressed into a hard line when she saw Ayanna step down from the wagon. "So you're the Indian girl," Mrs. Mackenzie said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I suppose you'll have to do, though. I told my Thomas he could do better." She looked Ayanna up and down like she was examining a horse for purchase. "Can you cook white man's food? Can you read? Do you even speak proper English?" Ayanna lifted her chin proudly. "I speak 3 languages, ma'am. I can read, write, and cook. My father made sure I was educated at the mission school." Her English was clear and precise, but this only seemed to annoy Mrs. Mackenzie more. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Mother, perhaps we should go inside and discuss the arrangements." He finally looked at Ayanna, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach turn. It wasn't hatred like the others showed, but it wasn't kindness either. It was the look of a man who saw her as a burden he had to bear. As they entered the small house, Ayanna noticed how the neighbors peered through their curtains, their faces filled with curiosity and disgust. The butcher's wife made the sign of the cross when she saw them. The banker turned his back completely, as if Ayanna carried some terrible disease. That first night, as she lay on a thin mattress in the tiny back room that would be her new home, Ayanna stared at the ceiling and wondered what her grandmother would say. The old woman had always told stories of warrior women who faced impossible odds with courage. "The eagle does not ask permission to soar," her grandmother would whisper. "It simply spreads its wings and rises above those who would keep it grounded." Outside her window, she could hear the town settling into sleep. Dogs barked in the distance, and somewhere a baby cried. This was supposed to be her new life, but it felt more like a prison. Tomorrow she would have to face these people again, endure their stares and whispered comments. She would have to pretend that their words didn't cut deep into her soul. But Ayanna was the daughter of a chief, granddaughter of warriors who had fought to protect their land and their people. She had survived the long journey from her homeland to this place where she was unwanted. She had learned to read the white man's books and speak his language. If she could do all of that, she could survive this too. As sleep finally came, she dreamed of the wide-open plains where she had once run free with her horse, Wind Dancer. In her dreams, the buffalo still roamed in great herds, and her people lived in harmony with the land. When she woke, she would face another day of cold, stares and cruel whispers, but tonight in her dreams she was still free. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the small wooden church that sat on the hill overlooking Willow Creek. Only a handful of people attended, and most came out of curiosity rather than celebration. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, stumbled through the words with obvious discomfort, as if marrying a Comanche woman might somehow stain his holy church. Ayanna wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Mackenzie had grudgingly provided. It was too big for her small frame and smelled of mothballs from years of storage. As she stood beside Thomas, she could feel the weight of disapproving stares boring into her back. The few women present whispered behind their gloves, and she caught fragments of their conversations. "Shame on Thomas for bringing such disgrace to his family name," hissed Mrs. Patterson from the general store. "Mark my words, no good will come of this unholy union." When the ceremony ended, there was no celebration, no feast, no joyful dancing. The townspeople filed out quickly, leaving Ayanna and Thomas standing alone at the altar. Even his own mother had already departed, claiming she had important business to attend to at home. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of loneliness and rejection. Thomas worked at the telegraph office during the day, leaving Ayanna alone in the house with his bitter mother. Mrs. Mackenzie made it clear that she expected Ayanna to earn her place through endless chores. She scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, washed clothes until her hands cracked from the harsh soap, and cooked meals that were never quite right according to her new mother-in-law. "Indian food is not welcome in this house," Mrs. Mackenzie declared when Ayanna tried to prepare a traditional stew with wild herbs she had found near the creek. "You'll cook proper Christian food or you won't cook at all." When Ayanna ventured into town to buy supplies, the shopkeepers treated her with cold politeness at best, outright hostility at worst. Children followed her down the street, making war whoops and pretending to shoot arrows. Their mothers did nothing to stop them. The local women crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming, pulling their children close as if she might scalp them right there in broad daylight. At the mercantile, Mr. Patterson would slam her purchases on the counter without a word, his eyes filled with disgust. When she needed fabric to mend Thomas's shirts, the seamstress, Miss Eleanor, quoted prices twice as high as what she charged other customers. "Indian money spends different than Christian money," Miss Eleanor said with a sneer when Ayanna questioned the price. "Take it or leave it." The isolation became a living thing that followed Ayanna everywhere. She tried to attend the ladies' church auxiliary meeting, thinking perhaps she could make friends among the women. They allowed her to sit in the back corner. But when she tried to contribute to their discussion about organizing a charity drive for orphans, Mrs. Patterson cut her off sharply. "I think we can handle Christian charity without input from your kind," she said, the words dripping with venom. Thomas offered little comfort when she shared her struggles with him. "You have to understand, Ayanna," he said one evening as she served him dinner with tears still fresh in her eyes from another day of cruel treatment. "These people have lived here all their lives. Change is hard for them. Maybe if you tried to be more accommodating." His words felt like another betrayal. She was trying to fit into their world, learning their customs, following their rules, but nothing she did seemed to matter. In their eyes, she would always be the unwanted Comanche bride who had invaded their peaceful town. At night, when Thomas slept beside her, Ayanna would slip out to the small back porch and look up at the stars. She would whisper prayers in her native language to the spirits of her ancestors, asking for strength to endure another day. The wind would carry her words across the plains toward the reservation where her family lived, and for a moment, she could almost imagine she was home. But home felt farther away with each passing day, and the walls of her new life seemed to close in tighter. She began to wonder if this was how her story would end, forgotten, ignored, slowly crushed by the weight of a town's hatred, until nothing remained of the proud Comanche woman she had once been. 2 months into her marriage, Ayanna discovered a narrow path that led away from town toward the surrounding hills. When the weight of hostile stares and whispered insults became too heavy to bear, she would walk this path to find moments of peace among the oak trees and wildflowers that reminded her of home. It was on one of these solitary walks that she first saw him. A tall man with weathered hands and quiet eyes sat on his horse at the crest of a hill, watching a small herd of cattle graze in the valley below. His name was Jacob Stone, though she wouldn't learn this for several more weeks. He owned a ranch that stretched across the hills outside town, and unlike the other people in Willow Creek, he didn't stare at her with hatred or curiosity. In fact, he didn't stare at all. When their paths crossed on the trail, he would simply nod politely and continue on his way, as if meeting a Comanche woman alone on a hillside was the most natural thing in the world. This simple act of treating her like a normal person rather than a curiosity or a threat meant more to Ayanna than he could possibly know. Jacob Stone was known throughout the county as a man of few words. He had lost his wife and young son to fever 3 years earlier, and since then he rarely spoke to anyone unless absolutely necessary. He conducted his business in town with efficient silence, paid his bills without conversation, and returned to his ranch where he worked from dawn to dusk with only his horses and cattle for company. The townspeople respected him because he was successful and white, but they found his silence unsettling. "That Stone fellow gives me the shivers," Mrs. Patterson often complained to her customers. "Never says more than 2 words at a time. There's something not quite right about a man who keeps so much to himself." But Ayanna found comfort in his silence. In a world where every word seemed designed to hurt her, Jacob's quiet presence felt like shelter from a storm. He never asked her questions about her people or made comments about her appearance. He simply existed in the same space without judgment, and gradually she began to time her walks to coincide with his rides. One afternoon, as autumn painted the hills in shades of gold and crimson, Ayanna came upon a scene that made her heart race with both fear and anger. 3 men from town had cornered a young coyote pup whose leg had been caught in a trap. The animal was terrified and wounded, snapping desperately at anyone who came near. "Just shoot the mangy thing and be done with it," one of the men was saying. "Probably got rabies anyway." "Wait," called another. "Let's have some sport first. See how long it takes to die if we just wound it a little at a time." Ayanna had seen enough cruelty in her short time in Willow Creek to recognize the twisted pleasure these men took in causing pain to something helpless. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Let me take the animal. It's just a baby. It doesn't deserve to suffer." The 3 men turned to look at her with surprise that quickly turned to amusement. "Well, look what we have here," said the largest of them, a man named Pete Rawlings who worked at the sawmill. "The Indian princess wants to save the mangy coyote. Makes sense, I suppose. Wild things should stick together." His companions laughed, and Pete stepped closer to Ayanna, his intentions clear in his leering smile. "Tell you what, Indian girl. You want this coyote so bad, maybe we can make a trade. A little entertainment for us, and you can have your precious animal." The other men moved to block her escape routes, and Ayanna realized she had made a terrible mistake. She was alone on the hillside with 3 men who saw her as less than human, something to be used and discarded. Her heart pounded as she tried to think of a way out of this situation. That's when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jacob Stone appeared on the ridge above them, sitting tall in his saddle with a rifle resting casually across his lap. He didn't say a word, but his presence changed everything in an instant. The 3 men looked up at him nervously. "Afternoon, Mr. Stone," Pete called out, his voice losing its confidence. "We were just dealing with this sick coyote here. Nothing for you to worry about." Jacob's eyes moved slowly from the trapped animal to Ayanna, then to the 3 men who had been threatening her. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Mrs. Mackenzie," he said, addressing Ayanna with a respect that made the 3 men shift uncomfortably. "That animal appears to be injured. Would you like some assistance in freeing it?" The simple question hung in the air like a challenge. By treating Ayanna with courtesy and offering to help her, Jacob was making his position clear without ever directly confronting the men. In the social dynamics of a small western town, his support carried enormous weight. Pete Rawlings and his friends exchanged uncertain glances. They could intimidate a lone Comanche woman, but Jacob Stone was a different matter entirely. He was white, wealthy, and respected in the community. More importantly, he was known to be an excellent shot and completely fearless. "Well," Pete stammered, backing away from Ayanna, "I suppose if you want to deal with a rabid animal, that's your business, Mr. Stone. Come on, boys. We got better things to do than waste time out here." The 3 men retreated quickly, mumbling excuses and avoiding eye contact. Jacob watched them go, before dismounting and walking slowly toward the trapped coyote pup. The little animal was still snarling and snapping, terrified by all the human activity around it. "He's scared," Ayanna said softly, kneeling at a safe distance from the trap. "In my culture, We believe coyotes are messengers between the world of spirits and the world of the living. They're sacred animals. Jacob nodded and studied the trap carefully. Steel jaws, but not too deep. Leg might be broken, but he should survive if we can get him free. He looked at Ayanna with something that might have been curiosity. You know, about healing animals? My grandmother taught me, Ayanna replied. She was a medicine woman. She said that all living things have the same spirit inside them, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. For the first time since she had known him, Jacob Stone smiled. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less haunted. My late wife would have said something similar. She had a way with wounded creatures too. Working together in comfortable silence, they managed to free the coyote pup from the trap. Jacob held the animal gently while Ayanna examined the injured leg. It was badly bruised and swollen, but not broken. She tore strips of cloth from her petticoat to make a temporary bandage, her movements sure and practiced. There's a cave about a mile north of here where he'll be safe while he heals, Jacob said. I could show you if you'd like to make sure he gets settled properly. It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make, and the kindness in his voice brought tears to her eyes. For the first time in months, someone was treating her like a human being worth listening to and helping. They rode together to the cave, Jacob on his horse and Ayanna walking alongside, carrying the wounded coyote in her arms. As they traveled, Jacob began to talk, really talk, sharing stories about his ranch, his cattle, and the land he loved. His voice was deep and gentle, and Ayanna found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving in Willow Creek. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman, Jacob said after Ayanna shared one of the medicine woman's teachings about the connection between all living things. My Ellen would have liked her. She always said the world would be a better place if people spent more time listening to nature and less time trying to control it. They settled the coyote pup in the cave with fresh water and some dried meat from Jacob's saddlebags. The little animal looked up at them with grateful eyes before curling up to rest in a bed of soft grass Ayanna had gathered. As they prepared to leave, Jacob turned to her with an expression of concern. Those men today, they won't bother you again, but you should be careful walking alone out here. There are others in town who might not be so easily discouraged. Ayanna felt a warmth spread through her chest at his obvious worry for her safety. Thank you, she said quietly, for helping me today, for treating me like a person instead of something to be feared or hated. Jacob's weathered face softened. Fear and hatred are easy emotions, Mrs. Mackenzie. They don't require much thinking or courage. Kindness takes more effort, but it's usually worth it. As they parted ways at the bottom of the hill, Jacob tipped his hat to her with the same courtesy he would show any lady in town. I hope our paths cross again soon, he said simply. Walking back toward town alone, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. There was at least one person in this hostile place who saw her as more than an unwanted outsider. Jacob Stone had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return, and his quiet strength had made her feel protected for the first time since leaving the reservation. That evening, when Thomas asked where she had been all afternoon, Ayanna simply said she had gone for a walk to gather herbs. She didn't mention the coyote, the threatening men, or Jacob Stone. Some things were too precious to share with someone who wouldn't understand their value. But as she lay in bed that night, Ayanna found herself thinking about Jacob's sad smile when he mentioned his late wife and the gentle way he had handled the wounded coyote. She wondered what it would be like to be married to a man who treated her with such respect and kindness, instead of the cold indifference she received from Thomas. Over the following weeks, Ayanna found herself looking forward to her walks in the hills with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. Almost every time she ventured out, Jacob Stone would appear on the trail, and they would spend an hour or two walking together while his horse followed behind like a patient dog. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal with each meeting. Jacob told her about his ranch, how he had built it from nothing with his late wife Ellen by his side. He spoke of his dreams to raise the finest cattle in Texas, and his love for the wild, untamed land that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Ellen used to say this country was too beautiful for just one person to own, he said one afternoon as they sat on a fallen log overlooking the valley. She believed the land belonged to itself, and we were just borrowers taking care of it for future generations. Ayanna felt her heart skip at these words. My people have always believed the same thing. The earth is our mother, and you cannot own your mother any more than you can own the wind or the rain. Jacob turned to look at her with new understanding in his eyes. That's a beautiful way to think about it. I never understood why some folks get so worked up about who has the right to live on what piece of ground. Seems to me there's enough room for everyone if people would just learn to share. These conversations were a balm to Ayanna's wounded soul. Jacob never made her feel foolish for her beliefs or tried to convince her that white ways were superior. Instead, he listened with genuine interest and often found common ground between their different backgrounds. But their friendship was not without risk. One day, as they returned from checking on the coyote pup, who was healing well and would soon be ready to return to the wild, they encountered Thomas on the road back to town. Ayanna's husband was riding the old mare he had borrowed from the livery stable, his face flushed with anger. Ayanna, Thomas called out sharply. What are you doing out here with Mr. Stone? Jacob's expression remained calm, but Ayanna could see the tension in his shoulders. Your wife was kind enough to help me track some lost cattle, he said smoothly. She has a natural talent for reading animal signs. It was a lie, but a harmless one that protected Ayanna from having to explain their real relationship. Thomas looked between them suspiciously, clearly wanting to say more, but unwilling to directly challenge Jacob Stone. Well, Thomas said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled jealousy. I'm sure Mr. Stone can handle his own cattle from now on. Ayanna has plenty of responsibilities at home. The ride back to town was tense and silent. That evening, Thomas confronted his wife directly. I don't want you spending time with that man, he said, his voice harder than she had ever heard it. People are already talking about us enough without you giving them more reasons to gossip. We were just talking, Ayanna replied, but even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. What she and Jacob shared was deeper than mere conversation. It was understanding, respect, and something else that she didn't dare name. I don't care what you were doing, Thomas snapped. You're my wife, and I won't have you running around the countryside with another man. It makes me look like a fool. That night, Mrs. Mackenzie joined her son in lecturing Ayanna about proper behavior for a married woman. Bad enough we have to live with the shame of having an Indian in the family, the older woman said with venom. Now you want to add adultery to your list of sins? The accusation stung because it came too close to the truth. Ayanna had never been unfaithful to Thomas indeed, but her heart had begun to wander toward the kind, gentle rancher who treated her like a human being deserving of respect and friendship. For several days, she avoided the hills and stayed close to home, trying to be the dutiful wife Thomas expected. But the walls of the small house seemed to close in on her, and the constant criticism from her mother-in-law became unbearable. When she could stand it no longer, she slipped out for what she promised herself would be one final walk. Jacob was waiting for her at their usual meeting place, as if he had known she would come. His face lit up when he saw her, but the smile faded when he noticed her red-rimmed eyes and the dejected slope of her shoulders. What's wrong? He asked gently. The kindness in his voice broke down the walls she had been building around her heart. The whole story came pouring out. Thomas's anger, his mother's cruel words, the growing isolation and despair that threatened to swallow her whole. Jacob listened without interruption, his jaw tightening with anger at the treatment she described. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the sunset that painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. I've been thinking, he said finally, about you, about this situation, about what's right and what's wrong. He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. I know this is complicated, and I know it's not my place to say anything, but I can't stand watching you suffer like this. Ayanna held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to hear what he might say next. There's talk in town, Jacob continued carefully. about the marriage not being legal under federal law. Something about tribal agreements not having proper authority. If that's true, if there was a way for you to be free of this arrangement, Ayana's heart pounded as Jacob's words hung in the air between them. The possibility of freedom seemed too precious to believe, too dangerous to hope for. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Jacob took a step closer, his weathered hands reaching out to gently touch her face. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Ayana. I know it's wrong. I know it's complicated. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel is just friendship." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she realized that her own feelings were reflected in his eyes. "Jacob, she began. But he placed a finger gently against her lips. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said softly. "But I want you to know that if there's a way for you to be free, if you want to be free, I'll be here waiting." That night, Ayana lay awake thinking about Jacob's words and the impossible choice before her. The next morning brought unexpected news that would change everything. A federal marshal arrived in Willow Creek with documents that threw the entire town into confusion. It turned out that Jacob had been right about the legal questions surrounding her marriage. The tribal agreement that had arranged her union with Thomas had been negotiated by someone without proper authority, making the marriage invalid under both federal and state law. Furthermore, new legislation had recently passed that gave Native American women the right to choose their own husbands without tribal interference. Thomas was furious when he learned the news, but there was nothing he could do. His mother was even angrier, ranting about the injustice of savages having more rights than decent Christian folk. But for Ayana, the marshal's arrival felt like a gift from the spirits of her ancestors. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Within a week, Ayana was officially free from her marriage to Thomas Mackenzie. She expected the townspeople to be relieved that the Indian problem was being resolved, but instead, their anger seemed to intensify. They had grown comfortable with their hatred, and the prospect of losing their favorite target for scorn left them feeling cheated. Mrs. Patterson organized a group of women to confront Ayana directly. "You may be legally free," she declared on Main Street for everyone to hear, "but don't think that changes anything. You're still not welcome in this town." But something had changed in Ayana during her months of struggle and suffering. The young woman who had arrived in Willow Creek frightened and alone had grown stronger through adversity. When she faced the angry crowd of townswomen, she stood tall and proud, every inch the daughter of Chief Running Bear. "I never wanted to be part of your town," she replied with quiet dignity. "I came here to honor my father's wishes and try to build a bridge between our peoples. You chose to burn that bridge with your hatred and fear, but I am not the one diminished by your choice." That evening, as she packed her few belongings, Jacob appeared at the door of the Mackenzie house. He had come to offer her a choice. She could return to her people on the reservation, or she could come with him to his ranch as his wife. "I know it won't be easy," he said, his hat in his hands and hope in his eyes. "There will still be people who disapprove, who try to make trouble for us. But I promise you this, you'll never face their hatred alone again." Ayana looked into the face of the man who had shown her kindness when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. She thought of his gentle hands caring for the wounded coyote, his respectful attention when she shared the wisdom of her grandmother, his quiet strength when he had protected her from those who would do her harm. "I choose love," she said simply. Their wedding took place not in the hostile church of Willow Creek, but under the open sky on Jacob's ranch, with the vast Texas plains stretching endlessly in all directions. The ceremony was conducted by a traveling preacher who cared more about the love between them than the color of their skin. The only witnesses were Jacob's cattle hands, who had come to respect their boss's choice, and the recovered coyote who watched from a nearby hill before disappearing into the wild. As they spoke, their vows with the sunset painting the sky in brilliant colors, Ayana felt the presence of her grandmother's spirit on the evening wind. The old medicine woman had been right. The eagle does not ask permission to soar. In the years that followed, Jacob and Ayana built more than just a successful ranch together. They created a refuge for anyone who needed shelter from the storms, of prejudice and hatred. Their home became a place where Native American children could learn to read and write, where former slaves could find work and dignity, where anyone who had been cast aside by society could find acceptance and belonging. Diuar. Townspeople of Willow Creek never fully accepted their union, but their disapproval mattered less with each passing year. Ayana had learned that true strength comes not from the approval of others, but from knowing your own worth and finding people who recognize it. She had arrived in Texas as an unwanted Comanche bride, ignored and despised by nearly everyone she met. But with the love of one silent rancher who saw past the surface to the woman beneath, she had transformed into something far more powerful, a bridge builder, a healer, a force for change in a world that desperately needed both courage and compassion. The girl who had once wept alone under the stars had become a woman who helped others find their own light in the darkness.